Good afternoon, I hope this finds you well, and welcome back to The Spirit of Scotland, in which is our first film of 2026. Now you may remember, if you cast your mind back to late in 2025, I did a film with Max Muir from Robert Bruce, Genius of Bannockburn, you'll find his link in the description, about where are the dead of Bannockburn. And we walked the field and discussed the day's events at Bannockburn and the aftermath of Bannockburn, in the hope that we could realise perhaps some of what went on and where the dead might be buried. And that got me thinking over the festive period, who would be responsible for burying the dead after the Battle of Bannockburn, and why is that important? Well, if we could figure that out and perhaps learn from some of their customs, it might just give us a little bit more of the jigsaw, which we would add to the bigger picture and give us a clearer view of exactly what went on the 23rd and 24th of June 1314. So who was responsible for the burials? Well, in general, the churches would be responsible for burials back in 1314. And they had certain customs and rules that they had to follow so that the souls of the dead could carry on into the afterlife. And there were various churches in the Stirling area. And we're going to look at those churches and decide, or look at who had the authority. What was the hierarchy of those churches? Who might have been responsible for burying the dead? And can we fill that picture out a wee bit more? So join me today as I take you around a few places and we look at the situation of the churches in 1314 in the Stirlingshire area and who might have the ultimate authority for burying the dead of Bannockburn. So let's go and have a wee look. Now, one of the important religious houses during the period of the Battle of Bannockburn was Cambuskenneth Abbey, founded in the 1140s by King David I of Scotland, a very pious man who actually founded quite a lot of churches and abbeys. The Cambuskenneth Abbey was originally an Arusian order of monks or canons which ruled it, which were based in France, but it ceded from them and went to the Augustinian order and was inhabited by Augustinian Canons. The Augustinians were the biggest order in Scotland at the time, with 23 houses around Scotland, 21 with men and 2 with canonesses in them. So it was a major order and played a major part in Scotland. Now their role was to serve their patron, who was the King of Scotland and his family, and to aid with the running of his kingdom. In other words, they were kind of civil servants to the king. They didn't have a congregation. They worked at a level, as I say, of civil service and government level, and dealt with the royal household. And just as a matter of course, isn't that a magnificent view there? Don't know if you can maybe just make out to the left hand side there the Wallace Monument in the background. It's a magnificent place to come down here. Unfortunately we can't get in and around the Abbey grounds just now as they're shut for the winter. So if you can bear with me, we'll talk a little about the Abbey and how it came about and its role in medieval Scotland with Robert the Bruce. As I say, you had a number of different religious orders in Scotland. You had Dominicans, Franciscans, Cistercians, the Augustinians ourselves, many others, but the Augustinians were much the largest. And they were founded, as I say, by King David I of Scotland, and the Bishop of St Andrews had a big say in their foundation. Now, abbeys were granted land, and they would work that land for their own sustenance. But it was very difficult for them to sustain that on their own. They needed other sources of help and income. And during its foundation, King David and the Bishop of St Andrews, they had looked at the other churches in the area, and one of the main churches, the Mother Church of Stirlingshire, St Ninian's, was granted to Cambuskenneth Abbey at its foundation. So they kind of worked in tandem, but Cambuskenneth Abbey would be the authority. So there you see the distinction that Cambuskenneth Abbey would work directly with the royal household, and St Ninian's would cover the Stirling parish area, which was Dunipace, Gargunnock, Larbert and King of Muirs. So the whole of Stirlingshire would be covered by them. Just a little bit about Cambuskenneth Abbey. It was central to a lot of what went on in medieval Scotland, but its location perhaps didn't do any favours. Preceding day 2 of the Battle of Bannockburn, its food stores were raided by the Earl of Atholl, who crossed the River Forth at the Abbey ford, killing a number of Scots defenders and stealing the food sources prior to day 2 of the battle. And being where it is, just a mile or so to the east of Stirling Castle, it was shown no favours by subsequent passing English armies and was sacked a number of times and burnt to the ground by Richard II, but it was rebuilt and used by future Scottish kings again. It really was quite a complex of buildings, quite a magnificent place. But once again, at the Scottish Reformation, it was destroyed in the 1560s. So it's had quite an interesting life. And what's left of it today is the bell tower. The rest of it, unfortunately, reduced back down to its foundations. But it's a magnificent example of a building which does date back to originally medieval times. Now, as I mentioned earlier on, the matrix ecclesia, or the Mother Church of Stirlingshire, Gargunnock, Dunipace, Larbert, King of Muirs, was St Ninian's. But at the time of the foundation of Cambuskenneth Abbey, when St Ninian's was given over to Cambuskenneth Abbey, there were also a number of other churches in the area. There was the Stirling Castle Chapel and the Holyrood Church of Stirling, which served not the outlying areas of Stirlingshire that St Ninian's did, but the burgesses. Is that how you say it? The burgesses of Stirling, the town centre, and perhaps a more affluent and richer people. And through the Bishop of St Andrews, they actually answered Holyrood and the Stirling Chapel, they actually answered to Dunfermline Abbey. So you can see there was a kind of hierarchy in the Stirlingshire area of the various churches. So it begs the question, given that John Barber says that the knights and lords that were killed at Bannockburn, on both sides, were buried in holy ground with due honours, who would be responsible for burying them? And for the normal fighters, for the normal body of the army, they were buried on the battlefield. So who would be responsible for doing that? Do we consider that perhaps Cambuskenneth Abbey, the Holyrood Church, the Stirling Chapel would have looked after the knights and the lords who were killed that day perhaps, and that the rank and file were buried by, or the authority for burial may have been given by St Ninian's? So let's go and take a look at St Ninian's and discuss that a little bit and see where that fits into the picture, and see if we can come to a bit of a conclusion about who would have been responsible for burying the different bodies, if you like, if you pardon the pun, of the army, because it was split into rank and file, knights and lords. So let's go and take a look at St Ninian's and discuss this a little bit further and see if we can come to some kind of conclusion, or perhaps you have some ideas yourself and I'd love to hear them. So get in touch in the comments and let me know. So here we are at St Ninian's Church, just about a mile and a half outside Stirling. And what you see there is a bell and clock tower, which is all that remains of the earlier church, which unfortunately was blown up during the Jacobite period, 1746. The Jacobites had stored some gunpowder in the church and accidentally that went off, destroying it. But that church had been built on the foundations of an even earlier church, which had been there in medieval times, during the time of Bannockburn, and indeed even earlier there had been a church here which was previously known as Eccles. Now St Ninian's, back in the time of Bannockburn, was known as the Matrix Ecclesia, the mother church, and they'd be responsible for the, I think it's pronounced tithe. Effectively, they would take 10% of all the revenue of the people who subscribed to this church, all of the people in the Stirlingshire parish, Dunipace, Gargunnock, Kingmuirs, Larbour area. They would give 10% of their annual earnings to the church, and in return they would help support Cambuskenneth Abbey, who, as I mentioned earlier, probably wouldn't be able to survive on royal patronage and self-sustainability alone. And interestingly, it was St Ninian's who had been granted the burial rights for Stirlingshire, all the areas previously mentioned, which also takes in the Battle of Bannockburn area. So someone would have to have the authority to do the religious ceremony over the dead people. And I believe that even though it was an invading enemy, that just as was said by John Barber, that the knights and lords were buried in consecrated ground with the due honour, I also believe that the rank and file would have been given a Christian send-off, and it would have been St Ninian's who would probably be responsible for overseeing that, because no doubt there would be a payment involved. Now, unfortunately, just as at Cambuskenneth Abbey, we can't get in to the church grounds because they've been closed for essential maintenance, which is going to take place in February this year, I believe. So we'll go around the back, take a seat somewhere, and we'll discuss the role that they had and how Bruce dealt with the dead and the prisoners after Bannockburn, and see if that can give us that other piece of the jigsaw that we're looking for. I'm here outside St Ninian's Church. I hope you enjoyed our walk around today. So what have we established? Well, we've established the hierarchy that existed within the church. Cambuskenneth Abbey tended to look after the King of Scotland and his family's religious needs, and they would act as civil servants to help run the country where required. St Ninian's Church would look after the parish of Stirlingshire and the tradespeople of that area, Dunipace, Gargunnock, Kingamuirs, Larbert. They would look after that, and they would also help to support Cambuskenneth Abbey. Then you had Holyrood and the Holyrood Chapel, and they would look after the townspeople. And you would also have, who were moving in at the time, the Dominicans, who had moved into Stirling town. And they also tended to look after the more affluent people and took up more urban residences as opposed to Cambuskenneth, who were much more rural in their positioning of their abbey. So who looked after who? Well, it's my thoughts that Cambuskenneth Abbey, Holyrood, perhaps the Dominicans, they would tend to look after the earls, the lords and the knights. And as John Barber says in his chronicle, they were buried with due honour in consecrated ground. And I believe that that's the people who perhaps would have looked after them. St Ninian's Kirk, in my view, they would have looked after the rank and file who died and were buried on pits on the battlefield. And I believe they would have been given a proper Christian burial, although they were buried in pits. Why do I think that? Well, Robert the Bruce had been excommunicated from the church, remember. And after his victory at Bannockburn, he would be keen to be seen throughout Europe as a respected king of his country. So he's not going to disrespect any of the dead. And indeed, you've got to remember there were plenty English canons and priests and chroniclers up at the time of Bannockburn. And had there been any disrespect shown, they would have certainly let us know about it. But in actual fact, they talked about how well he looked after the prisoners and the dead. And we have evidence of that with the Earl of Gloucester and Clifford. They were sent home to their dead bodies were sent home to their families. Marmaduke de Twenge, the English knight that met Robert the Bruce the day after the battle on the battlefield, was wined and dined and sent home with gifts. So that was mentioned by the English chroniclers, how well he looked after and respected the defeated enemy after Bannockburn. So how do we find out? Where's the evidence to suggest that perhaps St Ninian's would have taken the authority to bury some of the dead and give them a Christian send-off? Well, you can only look through perhaps the church history, the abbey history, to find that. And evidence like that is quite scarce, so we can only keep looking for it. But I believe that that was certainly the case, that they were given a Christian burial, and that would have been well accepted throughout England and Europe, and would have raised Robert the Bruce's status throughout Europe. So given that, why is it so difficult to find the bodies? How many were there? Well, despite a lot of chroniclers from across the board vastly exaggerating the numbers of people who took place in various battles anywhere in Europe, and in Bannockburn we had numbers from 30,000 to 50,000 to 100,000, and we know that that's exaggerated. And John Barber himself exaggerated the numbers. But when it came to talking about the dead knights, he come out with a figure of saying that 200 pairs of spurs were taken. Suddenly that becomes much more realistic. And that would equate to about 10% of the amount of knights we knew that were up here, around 2,000. And if we extrapolate that to the army, which we thought was about 20,000, that would have left perhaps about 2,000, a very conservative estimate, dead on the battlefield. Probably a lot more than that, but a conservative estimate. So why is it so difficult to find 2,000 buried bodies on the battlefield? Well, there's a number of reasons. So a lot of development has taken place. The A91 road runs right through the middle of the battlefield, and there's a lot of urban development, urban sprawl has moved into rural areas. So it may have been built upon. Although you would think that as development took place, that they would have been found, and they haven't. So we can only take it that they're still there to be found in an undeveloped place. That being the case, why have they still not been found then? Well, given the history of other battles and the difficulty of finding bodies, you look at Agincourt, Crecy, Towton, Bosworth, Waterloo. All of these, Hastings, all of these major battlefields have the same problem. They all ask, where are the bodies? And very few have been found. Waterloo itself, they actually reckon a lot of the dead bodies were taken away and the bones were ground up for bone meal and fertiliser. And throughout the UK, a lot of medieval cemeteries were dug up and the bones used for the same bone meal and fertiliser. And in fact, a bill was actually put through the UK Parliament at one point to stop this practice taking place, and the bill was defeated. So it's sad to say, but actually human bones are seen as a resource. Where there's money to be made, obviously there's no stopping some people. And you also get the situation too, where you may have had English armies coming up after Bannockburn, may have dug the bones up and buried them elsewhere, because they didn't want, that was an embarrassment to them. Bannockburn was a huge embarrassment to the English, and they didn't want anything showing where that battle had taken place, and they didn't want to see signs of a burial of all their dead. They may have dug them up, as has happened in other battlefields, taken them away and reburied them in consecrated ground elsewhere. So there's a number of reasons why it's so difficult to find the bones of the dead after great battles. But we can only keep pursuing, and we can only take those little snippets of information and put them together, come to what we think is a logical conclusion based on that information, follow up, and hopefully we can get there. So I hope you've enjoyed that today. We're going to keep pursuing this, and hopefully we can get to the stage where we do find something that allows us to say with confidence that this is where the battle took place, and we can get a memorial built to commemorate all those people who so bravely defended their nation, and all those other people who sadly died that day. So, thank you for tuning in. I hope you have enjoyed this film. If you have any thoughts on the matter, if you have any awareness of church papers anywhere, it might give us just that little bit of a clue. Let me know. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you've enjoyed this and you want to see more, like and subscribe to this channel. It gives me encouragement to do more. And what is our quest ultimately? To find out exactly where the Battle of Bannockburn took place, where the dead are buried, and where we can build that perfect picture of what went on with Scotland's most historic and important battle. So thanks for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you in future instalments on Spirit of Scotland. So take care until then. Ta-ra now.